What's going on, everybody? Brennan Rust here at Bokashi Earthworks. Yo, what up? I just started a live.
Oh, dude.
Yeah.
I'll let you go then. I'll hit me up afterwards.
What's going on?
Oh, not much. It's Monday, so I was just reconvening with you. I've been sick for the past few days, so I'm just kind of out of my head. But yeah.
I'll hit you up in a bit.
Okay. All right, peace.
What up, good vibe terps? We're going to be talking about how to use the humate fertilizers and obviously smoking. Oh, I have a scientific report on coconut water as well that I built. I forgot I did this last week. I never did a live and talked about it. So maybe we'll also talk about coconut water and coconut powder as well. What's going on, Dragon Master? All right, so today I wanted to talk about the different humate formulations. We've got the nitrogen humate, the complex humate, and the K humate. So these are actually produced from lignite, leonardite. I'm sure you've heard of that. If you've ever bought in something like humic acid from Down to Earth, what they do is they take the leonardite, which is a type of lignite, and they just crush it up, and then they sell you this. In the form unprocessed, leonardite doesn't have a whole lot of benefits. It does act as a soil conditioner and can help with, soil structure. But in its raw form, the humic and fulvic acids are not soluble. They're captured in a mineral complex along with all of the nutrient benefits from this material. And with the process that we do, what happens is we micronize this. We turn it into a very, very fine mesh, very fine powder to increase the surface area. And then it is reacted. We extract the humic and fulvic acid and the mineral nutrients. It's stabilized, and then we end up with humate. So the three different formulations that we have are the high nitrogen formulation, the complex, and the potassium. This is the high nitrogen formulation. And high nitrogen formulation is for vegetative phase, or for crops that require more nitrogen, like leafy greens, things like that, grass, if you're doing it for lawns, but things like cabbage, kales, all of those types of leafy greens, arugula, high nitrogen formulation. Also for crops that need high nitrogen at the beginning, because sometimes with these products in commercial crop production, you'll switch formulations depending on the stage of growth. That's how it works for cannabis. So the high nitrogen formulation is going to be your vegetative formulation. And this is when we're talking about NPK. So the numbers on the back here, NPK, which are 12, 9, and 5. That is the percentage of the actual nutrient in the product. So it's 12% nitrogen, 9% phosphorus, and 5% potassium. And then it also contains 45.45% fulvic acids, and the nitrogen formulation has 0.76% humic acids. Now, I wanted to get in and talk just a little bit about the differences of humic and fulvic acid. So there's the reason why they're classified as humic and fulvic is because the actual molecular size of the actual carbon chains. So humic acid has a larger carbon chain. And what it does is it acts for long-term holding capacity, so it can increase the ECE, or the exchange capacity. And what that is essentially you have clay colloids in the soil that have a net negative charge, and they'll hold on to positively charged nutrient ions. And what happens is I like to think of them as parking spots, right? So the nutrient can kind of take a parking spot, and then when water comes in, they move into the water, and other nutrients can take their space. And they are kind of diffused into water when they're uptaken in their ionic form via mass flow, like nitrogen, for instance, calcium, magnesium, potassium. All those things can move in soluble solution, and the plant uptakes them. So it can increase basically the parking spaces, the ECE that those nutrient ions can attach to in the soil and stay in a metabolically available form attached to those, or weakly bonded to those soil colloids. And this also happens with organic matter. This also happens with both humic and fulvic acid. While nutrient ions are being chelated, the humic and fulvic acid contain negative net charges that allow, or in some places, depending on the structure, a positive charge that'll hold on to those nutrient ions. The difference between humic and fulvic acid is mainly based off of the size, and the size affects the solubility as well. So because humic is a larger molecule, it's better for long-term nutrient release, increased ECE, and then the main benefit is actual soil structure. So when you have soils that may be like really compact and stuff, and you get that humic in there, what it does, those longer carbon chains, they do a couple of things, right? So they help with the housing of microbiology. So they're not so much used as a fuel source, because the carbon chains are oftentimes too long for them to solubilize that carbon and get that release of carbon for the fuel they need. So they act as more like housing, right? So they create conditions that are going to be beneficial to the microorganisms because they can kind of house them. They are larger structural components. And also what they do is they help with soil structure, which is going to help with water infiltration and gas exchange. Now, fulvic acid is a smaller size, and so it's mobile, and stays in it, and it's soluble at all pH ranges. And also because of that size, it's also more mobile to the plant. So the plant can uptake the fulvic acids and the nutrient ions that are attached to those fulvic acids at any pH range, and more efficiently, without having to change kind of some of its energy mechanics that are associated with the sodium potassium ion pumps, which plants have to dump ions, positively charged ions, to uptake positively charged ions, because they're trying to create an electrical gradient inside that sap, and it can't just keep taking up more positive charge. It has to balance that charge out. And when you get nutrients that are bonded to humic and fulvic acids, especially fulvic acids, it neutralizes some of that charge, so the plant doesn't have to expend energy to release those charges into the soil. The plant also does that with root exudates and stuff, because some things, like a good example, like if you had iron and manganese, which are more soluble at a lower pH range, the plant might change it's going to reduce the pH of the rhizosphere. It's going to reduce all of the nutrient ions into their available form, in their reduced form. So fulvic acid also acts as an energy source, because the organic molecule has a much lower weight. It binds to nutrients more efficiently than humic and fulvic acids, keeps them soluble, but it also it's bioavailable to the bacteria and the fungus in that system as well. So it acts as a biostimulant to stimulate the microbiome, and it's acting as a fuel source, and all of the nutrients that are attached to it act as a nutrient source. And so fulvic acids have much, much greater benefit than humic acids when it comes to bioactivity and bioavailability perspective. But humic acids are a little bit better for building soil structure, building soil EC. And also, one of the things too is humic acids are better for if you have like an agricultural soil that's high in heavy metals. Let's say it's high in arsenic and you use humic acids. It's better to use a humic acid to bind for long-term chelation and storage, so that way those things aren't bioavailable and there's less uptake. Fulvic acid, on the other hand, creates nutrient bioavailability by both, giving that energy to the microbiomes, which are to the microbes, which are essentially releasing a bunch of different enzymes and organic acids and all these other things that are doing biochemical work on that system. Well, the fulvic acids are a huge driving factor of that. So when we're talking about conventional crop production, let's say corn, for instance, you only need about 36 kilos, 37 kilos over the course of an entire crop cycle, divided amongst the three different formulations. So at the very beginning, you might use 20% of your 37 kilos at the beginning with your nitrogen. And then when you get in later into the season, you might go back another in a month and water in, another 40% or 50% of complex humate. And then when things start to tassel on the corn, a month later, you would take the high potassium formulation, and what you would do is you would use the last 30% of those 37 kilos. And so you're not applying nearly as much from an agronomic standpoint. Typically, corn would require about 240 pounds of nitrogen. So if you're using urea, you're going to need about 500 pounds of urea. This is in a, let's say a deficient soil. And then you also might need, or you might do 250 pounds of urea and then 250 pounds of DAP, diammonium phosphate. And then you might be doing like 100 pounds of muriate of potash and then 5 pounds of chelated micronutrients. That is an example of what an agronomist from, let's say, university would conventionally apply versus 37 kilos of humates applied, in a cycle, which is much more efficient. It doesn't have any environmental impact. All right. So for a hybrid system where you're going to do something like a salt base with the humate fertilizer, what you would be doing is between 1 and 2 milliliters per liter, or approximately 5 to 8 milliliters per gallon of water. And what you do is you would add the humate first, so it distributes all that fulvic acid. That way, when you put your salt base in with it, it will capture those nutrient ions and keep those nutrient ions bioavailable. A lot of times what happens is a lot of these chemical fertilizers are actually they don't have a lot of compatibility. And what happens is in solution, they'll start to create precipitation reactions. And the fulvic acid actually decreases that because it's capturing those nutrient ions and keeping them from reacting. And so if you were to use, the humate fertilizer in conjunction with a salt base, you would want to decrease your base A and B. So your NPK would be greatly reduced, up to 60%. And the reason why is because those conventional fertilizers, they usually only have a 15 to 20% use efficiency. And that's why we see so much drain to waste and so much runoff, right? We're not recapturing that. The plant isn't utilizing it, because the longer those things are combined, the further those precipitation reactions and the less efficient those fertilizers become. But when you're introducing this amount of fulvic acid into the solution first, it increases the efficiency. You can use less water, you can do less runoff. You can actually, I recommend decreasing the runoff, especially if you might be running 3.5 EC and you're able to cut it down to like 1.5 or maybe all the way down to 1.2 in these hybrid systems. And so the benefits of this is that it also contains the NPK as well, and some trace nutrients or some trace micronutrients, and also some secondary nutrients as well. So it works really efficiently with other fertilizers to create better nutrient use efficiency with what you're doing, so you can do less and still get the same result or even better result and better quality, because you're introducing, a carbon compound that is naturally found in nature that really fuels a lot of these biological systems, even when it comes to from a genetic standpoint with the plants, because a lot of times these compounds are stimulating genetic responses in plants via nutritional pathways and via carbon mechanics. So nitrogen humate in, like, let's say a living soil system, or where we're using a peat or cocoa as a base with compost, what we call a living soil or a modified growing mix. Typically those soils have a lot of nutrients in them as well, but they might not always be in available form. And so and this is how I do it, I'm running soil beds. When I run humate, I'm doing it more like an additive. Like if you were feeding in a synthetic system, you're giving it a couple milliliters per liter, or, maybe 5 to 8 milliliters per gallon. And you are doing that all the time, right? Where you're feeding it, maybe once a day or whatever. With the living soil systems, you're using it more like an additive, because what's happening is when you're using this, you're delivering the NPK and the other nutrients along with the humic and fulvic acids. But when it goes into that system, the fulvic and humic acid is going to grab onto a lot of the things that are already solubilized, that are in solution, and it'll keep those in basically a bioavailable form in that system. And so whenever you're watering and applying water, you're getting all of these soluble organic compounds with chelated nutrients. Plus you have that really large diversity of carbon substrates, whether it's from your compost to your meals, the cocoa and the peat, compost, leaf matter that you're putting back into the system. So there's a diverse amount of fuel sources and nutrients being turned over. And when those nutrients are being turned over in that biological system, the nutrients can oxidize, or they could have reactions with other nutrients. These things happen, it's just part of chemistry and nature. And when you have the soluble organic molecules like humic and fulvic acid, citrate, oleic acid, you know, acetic acid. These are all, you know, fulvic acid, humic acid substances that are going to grab on to those nutrients as they're cycled and keep them in a bioavailable form. So what I like to do with the humate is I like to add the N-humate just usually once in veg, you know, just to get things started off. And if I'm going like a longer amount of time, which I usually just veg for a short period of time, I'll keep my mom's and I'll use the N-humate, you know, maybe like once a month or as needed for my mom's, just to keep them nice and healthy. But if I'm vegging for a longer period of time, I'm usually doing like a little starter shot, maybe at 20% when I'm transplanting my clones, just to get them going. And then maybe a couple of weeks later. But it's usually in these types of living soil, usually only about once per month or once every 4 weeks, because it's very efficient and it's creating better efficiency within that media as well. All right, complex humate. And I'll get to all these questions too. So stick around and I'll answer all the questions that you guys are asking. Complex humate. So the complex humate, if you look at this, it's got a 997. So it's more of an even distribution of NPK. And so this product is like, I'll use this product right here usually for transition or for like mid-cycle fertilization, whether it's potatoes or tomatoes or anything like that. This is typically what I'm using. I'm using the complex. So during transition, right when you flip is typically when I use it in my beds. So if I know I'm about to flip, I'll hit them once, and then I won't feed anything fertilizer wise usually for almost a month. Same thing and same application rate when it comes to like a synganic approach. So you'd be using 5 to 8 milliliters per gallon of water, or about, 1 to 1.5, 2 milliliters per liter. And then you just decrease your base A and B when you water, and you can also decrease your runoff. And this again has this one has 44.73% fulvic acids and 1.63% humic acid. And then K-humate, which is the most popular product among these products because everybody is always looking to boost their productivity and their yields and quality. And so this has a lower amount of nitrogen. The formulation is 6, 12, 10. So it's got a higher amount of phosphorus and potassium. And so this is for, in conventional agriculture, for like really heavy fruiting plants, things like squash, things like melons, cucumbers, even flowers for ornamentals. Fruit trees is a big one. They love that potassium. They need a lot of energy to produce, heavy fruiting crops. And so I use this typically at about week 4 of flower. And then that's usually the last application of humate I do in a living soil system. If you are, in transit after your transition phase, when you're in a synganic setup, you can add this again, just like you would at any of the same strengths as the other humates, 5 to 8 milliliters per gallon. You decrease your A and B, but you would use this formulation in flowering. And, the benefit of this is when it comes, you need potassium throughout the whole cycle. Like all of these contain N, P, and K, but you want to really make sure that you have enough potassium when you're, before you really hit flowering, because if you stall out on potassium, a lot of major things happen. The plant uses potassium for the sodium ion pump. It regulates the guard cells on the stomata, so it's responsible for the evapotranspiration mechanics within that plant and the movement of water. And so if you're not moving water, the plant's not uptaking nutrients, and potassium can really, really limit the ability to have the high quality and high yields if you're deficient in it. So the potassium humate is actually one of the, I think, highest sellers out of the 3 humates, because everybody's always looking to, give a little boost in flowering. So that's a little bit about the humates. Again, you can use them in any type of scenario, whether you're using it for your lawn, or if you're growing squash or giant pumpkins, or you're growing cucumbers or peppers, potatoes. Like I grow a lot of my own stuff. We're growing weed, whether you're in a conventional agricultural soil, like an outdoor soil, whether you're using a potting mix from the store, or whether you're using a modified growing mix, living soil, whether you're in cocoa and doing synganic, or cocoa or totally organic. Like, the products are really great, because also, let's say you're doing, I get this all the time. Hey, can I use the humate and the microbes at the same time? Yeah, they're totally co-compatible. What's going to happen is the fulvic acid in these products are actually going to give more fuel to this when they're combined together. And the nutrients are bioavailable to the plant, but also the microorganisms. So the microorganisms, when you're combining microbes, whether it's trichoderma and bacillus, and in these, when you're doing a drench, they're all co-compatible, because they're creating synergy, right? Fuel and resource for the microorganisms to continue to proliferate. The only reason that I like to separate them is because if I'm just mixing everything together, I'm like, I don't really have anything to do in my setup, because I'm using beds. So I like to kind of rotate my products. That way I just feel like I'm more involved in the process, and not just going in there and watering every couple of days. I like to, oh, I'm going to mix in this time, and I'm going to, that's just me, because I like to feel more involved, because my system is so simple. It's very easy to just step away and just check on it every couple of days if I want. So, and then also co-compatible with other products, things like the calcium silica, right? It's got 51% silica in it, and it's got twice as much calcium as gypsum. It's got a little magnesium and some iron. They're co-compatible. They work together. So all of our products can be used in conjunction together, or in conjunction with other nutrient lines. The only product that I would say is probably not co-compatible with salt bases in solution is the calcium silica, and it's because when you're liberating the calcium ions, when you put this in solution, the phosphorus from either the potassium phosphate or the diammonium or monoammonium phosphate that's in a salt-based nutrient can react with that calcium and cause precipitation. So, but you can use it as a top dress for sure in like cocoa and stuff like that. So that was just a little bit of information. I hope that helped you guys out. I tried to be pretty quick and just make the information as easy to understand as I can for you guys. So now is the time I'm going to go through here and do Q&A. You've been using the fulvic acid. I encourage you to try ours. Try our product. I don't think there is any other product on the market that contains as much fulvic acid as our product does, and that's because Dr. George developed a proprietary process. Greetings from Germany. Awesome. Welcome. Here's a question, unrelated to the humates, but what is the best product for fungus gnats? So I personally use a product called Microbe Lift BMC. It is a mosquito, product, a product that kills mosquito larvae, but it works on fungus gnats really well. And I've also seen it anecdotally with not like any data, but I've just seen it work from experience on root aphids as well. You don't need much, but if you increase those dosage rates up, it can have an impact on root aphids. And if you just use it, once every, month or 5 weeks, you shouldn't have an issue. It's really great stuff. Works really good. Nematodes are good too. I've used nematodes in the past, but the problem that I've experienced with the nematodes is the efficacy when it comes to getting them shipped from different companies. I've gotten nematodes that were dead, and also I feel like the nematodes are much more expensive when you can buy a gallon of that microbe lift BMC for about $75 for a gallon of it, and you only need a couple of milliliters per gallon of water for it to be really effective. And so a single bottle for me will last me like a year, maybe even more. Oh, that's awesome. Trent's got a garden, says, hey, I just chopped my girls last night. Hands in the arms have never been so sticky. I'm assuming he's using the bokashi stuff. Yeah. But I do like nematodes, man. Biological solutions, I'll always, they'll always be a yes in my book. Anytime that we can use things that are from nature is going to be a benefit because you're going to have less negative impacts for the most part. So this is a good question. Is it a good feed schedule for mother plants? Feeding N humates 1 or 2 milliliters every feed, or can you just water it in full strength every few weeks to a month? That is up to you. And, we've built feed schedules and stuff, but it's really just a suggestion because everybody's system is different. If you're getting Michigan made, or if you get Build a Soil or Kiss or Bokashi soil, they're all going to be slightly different. The nutrient levels in those soils are going to be different. And so your approach, it can't just be like a one approach. You can't say, oh, you need this, 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 and this, because those substrates are different. Same thing with outdoor soil. Substrate's different. If you're doing cocoa, right? If you're doing cocoa, you might want to feed a couple of milliliters more frequently, but it's up to you because both of those things will work, right? If you just want to feed a couple of milliliters every feed and do kind of a spoon feed, it'll work like that. Or you could just add it all in at once and it'll work like that. It's going to be bioavailable either way. And it's really up to the grower. And I always recommend people to play around a little bit, see what works best for you because everybody's got a different system. I have people that are using the bokashi in like auto pots and they're bottom feeding, and doing different things that somebody else may be doing differently. Like me, I'm doing soil beds and I'm using them about once every month for the humates. I use the calcium silica more frequently than I do the humates because I'm using the calcium. I want, good calcium levels throughout the whole cycle. So what are your thoughts on adding sulfur as a micronutrient for maximizing terpene expression? Any experience or tips? Yes, this is a good question. So I do not recommend adding sulfur. And the reason why is because elemental sulfur is going to be biologically converted into sulfate. Now, if you're deficient in sulfur, I would recommend, instead of adding like elemental sulfur, which will drastically drop your pH and cause a lot of nutrient problems, especially in a small system if you over apply it. What I recommend is things like gypsum. So gypsum is calcium sulfate, right? Or Epsom salt, which is magnesium sulfate, or potassium sulfate, even micronutrient sulfate. So typically the organic mineral-based meals, they're not organic like carbon-based, but the naturally occurring things like gypsum and magnesium sulfate those can be added into the system, and typically that is enough to get to the desired levels of sulfur in a system. And I see this because I look at the, the data, the soil data from the labs. So I don't recommend using sulfur like that. The only time I'm ever using elemental sulfur is if it's micronized sulfur and I'm doing something like an integrated pest management application, and I'm never spraying it on the soil. I'm only spraying down the plant. So if you know that you have, let's say, hemp russet mite in your area, and you know that you're going to be growing an outdoor crop, you might be going out there and spraying elemental sulfur on your plants, once a week as preventative maintenance. Those types of situations are the only time that I really use sulfur. Otherwise, the sulfur that I'm getting is coming in from those other inputs. And another thing to be aware of is when you have really high elevated sulfate in your media, if you're trying to do drybacks, or if your media dries back, what happens is it spikes your EC and it causes a lot of osmotic stress. That's not good for the plant. But you are correct in your assumption that having adequate sulfate levels, available sulfate to the plant, can increase oil and terpene production. We also see this in things like lavender crops, where they will make sure that they have, those crops typically they're using more inputs that contain, like gypsum, for instance, that contain sulfate, so that way they can maximize the oil and terpene production. But also, to maximize oil and terpene production, making sure that you don't over fertilize with nitrogen, and that your nitrogen levels are decreasing the further you go into flowering. So that way you see a natural senescence, natural color change on the plant. That's what you want, like fall colors. I'm going to be growing a giant pumpkin with the lineup next year. Dude, do it this year. You still got time. Yep. Marcus Green Thumb, that's a great point. Been loading up with calcium and veg. Front loading, that's one of the things that I've talked about a lot before. Front loading calcium and making in veg like really tough. And the reason is this. So in veg, we're usually running a lower VPD, right? So the transpiration rate of that plant is lower. So you don't need as much potassium in that stage. So you can push calcium easier without having any antagonisms, because typically if you have too much calcium, you won't get enough potassium. But since the plant doesn't need as much potassium at that stage, you can front load that calcium and really build up those leaf tissue calcium percentages, right? Because calcium isn't mobile in the plant. It's mobile. It goes into the plant through mass flow, so it'll move, and wherever it lands in the plant, that's where it's staying. So we want to build up the calcium levels throughout the whole plant, especially in veg, if we want to have good disease resistance, and we want to have really good yields. And calcium is a messaging signaling molecule, so it's responsible for a lot of different things that are happening internally within the plant when it's communicating, acquired immune defenses, and calcium is responsible for a lot of that type of stuff. So that way you can front load it and really get it. But then what you're doing is when you hit transition, you want to make sure you're getting enough of that K, because for the flowering aspect, you're also, remember, you're increasing your VPD, right? So the transpiration rate is going to get higher, which means you need that potassium. You need to get, if you want to get those yields all loaded up. But you need to maintain steady calcium levels throughout the whole entire cycle. That's one of the things, like that I can give, like, as my expert advice to everybody, making sure that you have adequate calcium, but be wary of your CalMag additives, right? Because those ratios are often wrong. And if they're like a CalNit derived, calcium nitrate derived, you could be adding nitrogen in the wrong phase of growth if you're doing it in flower. So single source calcium inputs, or things like this calcium silica, work really great. gypsum is good, but you also have to be aware too much sulfate can cause osmotic stress. Oyster shell is good, but you have to be wary of too much sodium and chloride in those types of products. Bone meal also has a lot of calcium, but it also bring in phosphorus as well. And then also calcium phosphate, which is mostly calcium with a very small percentage of insoluble phosphorus. So all of those types of amendments could be really good as additional calcium sources that you can kind of maybe spoon feed into your system throughout flower. Yeah, the sulfur would have to be elemental sulfur. If you were using it as veg for IPM, it would still have to be biologically converted through the sulfur cycle, through sulfur sulfate cycle, sulfur cycling bacteria. And I'm not sure about the efficiency of that cycling process on the phyllosphere. So, even just spraying like your plants with magnesium sulfate, because that's another pro tip I recommend. If you really want to boost plant vitality and just the overall robustness, spraying Epsom salt at 1 tablespoon per gallon twice a week in veg until about the second week of flower will do magical things. And the reason why is because if you can get better calcium and potassium uptake, magnesium is very antagonistic to both of those. And typically the forms that we're using, which is Epsom salt, magnesium sulfate, both either if you're using an organic system or you're doing a synthetic system, they're still using the same natural occurring mineral. And it's very soluble and it can push those other elements out of solution and antagonize the uptake of those. And so if you just spray it instead of trying to add it into your system, the plant, it's so soluble and it can be taken up through the stomata so easily that it just has wonderful benefits where it mitigates some nutrient antagonisms in the media while delivering the nutrient directly to the plant. So it's another big tip. Yep. One of the cool things too. So Mint made a comment. He says, "I think the most impressive thing that I've noticed using the complex at Flip and seeing how they jump through pre-flower to flower. It's awesome. I just flipped some PK M10 and they're flying." One of the things too that I notice is when when you flip and you transition from vegetative to flowering, that is the time in which the plant is going to be utilizing the most amount of nutrients because it goes through that bolting phase that usually lasts 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the genetics, where the plant is increasing the biomass at the greatest rate. And so having your environment dialed in at that time, having proper nutrients, but also having better availability of manganese at this time, which is more of a reproductive nutrient, I have noticed, and we're going to do some data research on this very soon, going to a science conference here in a couple of weeks, and while meeting with all the research team, we're going to talk about the project that we're going to and how we're going to lay everything out. But one of the things that I wanted to look at is decreasing the onset of flowering, so that way you get more bud versus biomass. And what I've seen is an increase in manganese can expedite the flowering process. And I've also seen it help with finishing faster. So all of this is just anecdotal through my experience over the years, but we're actually going to do some research on ionomics and looking at the total nutrient makeup of an organism and how and what genes are upregulated that may be causing the response that we're looking at. I'm not sure what he's. Here's another question from AWDST8. When using Calcil with the humates, would you still start the Calcil Plus first, or does it not matter? So rule of thumb for me is I always, if I'm going to be adding anything besides humates, I always start the humate first. And the reason why I like to do the humate fertilizer first is because when you have that, soluble in solution, that solution contains a large percentage of humic and fulvic, especially fulvic acid. So when you add other things into the solution, it'll capture those nutrient ions when they're soluble. So I always like to use humic and fulvic acid fertilizer first. Would suggest top dressing the calcium silica running cocoa? Yes, I would. You can do about, to start off when you're first starting, do like a tablespoon per gallon of media. So if you're running a 2-gallon pot, do 2 tablespoons, and then you can do kind of water it in, or you can just top dress like a teaspoon per gallon of media, like 3 or 4 times through the rest of the cycle. Yeah, spoon feeding might be best for, earth boxes. It just depends on your situation. Oh, this is great. John Scott says, been using the Bokashi Earthworks for over a year now, and I have seen the production of trichomes explode. The stank. Your products cause express flavor and aroma more so than any other line I've tried. Well, I'm glad that you're liking it, man. Here we go. Your spores. My microscale broke, and I was wondering about how much of the spores equal 0.3 grams of spores, like 1/4 teaspoon. I think it's probably about 1/8 of a teaspoon. And you only need 0.15 of a gram. So this is double the application. You only need 0.15 of the bacillus and 0.15 of the trichoderma. If you're going to use them separately, I recommend 0.3. But if you're going to do both together, they increase each other's efficacy, so you can decrease them. My thoughts on flushing are this. So I only ever flush if there is something that's in excess in the media that needs to be removed. Other than that, I'm really taking a close and precise approach to nutrient fertilization. That way I'm not over fertilizing. If you're not over fertilizing, you're fine. We don't flush corn, we don't flush, tomatoes and all that other stuff. We don't do that because what we're doing is we're trying to get exact fertilization. So what's needed by the plant is there, and as it grows through the cycle, it's using up what's needed. That's kind of the idea. But if you have something like excess nitrates or excess sodium or problems of excess, then you can flush those out. But that's basically like a remediation process. I think the idea of flushing came from the hydroponic era, at least for me, because what would happen is we'd be running something for, a couple months in a system. And after a couple of weeks, you'd start to see precipitation build up, and you want to rinse that out. And so what we would do is we'd flush out our systems, dump that water out, and then refill our resis with new solution. So we would actually, we would flush, and it wasn't like we're flushing for days. We're just flushing out the system to rinse out any excess nutrients. So that way, when we add new stuff, it's like in the correct ratios and stuff like that. And then at the end, we would flush, and we weren't really flushing. We'd, clean out the system, flush out, and then just run water. But that was just in the hydro days, and that was just to help, finish them off, make sure that, we're not over, giving them too much fertilizer, and that they're kind of utilizing whatever's left in them. And, you know, we'd also decrease the amount of nutrients that we were giving the plants towards the end of the cycle. So we'd have like a ramp up in veg. We'd go to the highest peak at, you know, bolting. We'd keep things pretty level, and then we'd start decreasing the amount of nutrients we were giving. I mean, that's how I did it back then. But it was really because of those precipitation reactions and the osmotic stress that's caused by the addition of these, you know, these compounds that aren't available. And it's just about getting those. I think it was really more about getting those out for us. And then I guess the idea is if you've over fertilized, you know, you're just using water in hopes that the plant can catabolize what it's already taken up and use what it's already taken up. So that way, you know, you don't end up with a product that tastes like shit at the end. But anyway, I'm going to get back to work. We do have the Trichoderma bacillus 20% off. I extended the Micro Plus sale as well because so many people were asking. So you can get on that sale still. It's 30% off the Micro Plus. And I'll talk to you guys soon.